Good morning and welcome to today's Hoofing It in the Morning update. Today, I want to ask one simple question. What happens when your work experience gets tested in public? Hoo boy! Because Christopher Luxon certainly talks a big game, like this example here.
Negotiations really testing the skills of Luxon, who's talked a big game.
I've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and I've done a lot of negotiations, getting the chemistry and getting the relationship right.
I've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions. It's about chemistry. That sounds impressive, right? Until you remember one very awkward thing. When Christopher Luxon was CEO of Air New Zealand, he caused a catastrophic falling out with the CEO of Virgin Australia. The Virgin Australia episode is probably the clearest example of Luxon's famous chemistry line coming back to bite him. Air New Zealand already had the Virgin relationship before Luxon arrived at the top. He did not build that alliance from scratch, and he did not earn his Virgin board seat through some independent deal-making genius. He was appointed to the Virgin Australia board in July 2014 because he was the chief executive of Air New Zealand, a major Virgin shareholder. Virgin Australia's own annual report described Luxon simply as a non-executive director and noted he was there as Air New Zealand's CEO. He was not the Virgin board chair. Elizabeth Bryan was the chair, so it is more accurate to say he was handed a seat at the table because of Air New Zealand's shareholding, not because Virgin went searching for Christopher Luxon, the master negotiator. And then came the falling out. Reports at the time said Air New Zealand's move to sell its 25.9% stake in Virgin followed Luxon's failed attempt to remove Virgin CEO John Borghetti. According to the reporting at the time, Luxon resigned from the Virgin board after failing to get support from other directors, including Chair Elizabeth Bryan and representatives of Singapore Airlines, Etihad, and Richard Branson's Virgin Group. In other words, he tried to push Borghetti out, could not get the room behind him, and then tossed his toys like a child having a temper tantrum. Christopher Luxon then signalled that Air New Zealand wanted out of the stakeholder contract. Borghetti trumped Luxon by bringing in China's HNA Aviation as a new investor, a move that was making it clear he was not waiting for Air New Zealand's blessing. This bad chemistry did not just bruise egos, it burned serious money. The cleanest way to frame the damage is this. Air New Zealand had reportedly spent close to 450 million Australian dollars building up its Virgin stake based on the approximate exchange rate at the time. But the disclosed sale proceeds were much lower, 298.3 million Australian dollars overall. So even allowing for exchange rates, dividends, parcel sizes, and accounting treatment, that points to Air New Zealand making a loss in the ballpark of 145 million Australian dollars on the investment. So when Luxon talks about doing a lot of negotiations and knowing how to get the chemistry right, Virgin Australia is the uncomfortable case study. That is not masterful deal-making. That is bad chemistry with a very expensive price tag. And isn't it interesting that Luxon was also handed his botany seat on a silver platter? But let's be fair, maybe all of his great negotiating skills happened during his time at Unilever and a men's soap and deodorant sales VP. So let's look at his time at Unilever. The information on the mergers Unilever did are easy to find on their website. Luxon worked for Unilever from 1993 until 2011 across Wellington, Sydney, London, Chicago, and Toronto. His own career history includes roles in brand management, global deodorants and grooming, and later Unilever Canada. And yes, Unilever is a giant company. It has bought and sold plenty of businesses, but there is a difference between working for a company that does deals and being the person doing the deals. In the early part of his career, he was in Wellington and Sydney doing brand and category work, not exactly billion-dollar deal making. Unilever did make deals at the time, but they were not in the region of the world or the categories that Christopher Luxon worked in. So no, he personally did not do mergers and acquisitions at this time. Then he moved to London around 2000, where his title was connected to global deodorants and grooming. Around that same time, Unilever did make some huge acquisitions, Best Foods, Ben & Jerry's, and Slim Fast, but those were largely food brands. And again, Luxon's timeline and expertise as a men's deodorant exec means he was not involved in these deals. Then he moved to Chicago. Again, his role was still around deodorants and grooming. By 2008, he moved to Canada and became head of Unilever Canada. Now here is where it gets a little more interesting. In 2010, Unilever agreed to buy Alberto Culver for $3.7 billion US. That deal involved personal care brands like Tresemme, VO5, St. Ives, and Noxzema, and the acquisition was completed in May 2011 after Luxon left Unilever. So could Luxon have been around the wider business when that happened? Maybe, at the beginning of the negotiations. Could he have had some involvement, especially from a Canada or personal care perspective? Possibly, but I doubt it. Is there any proof he has done a lot of mergers and acquisitions? Nope. And now we have the India free trade deal. The government is selling this as a once-in-a-generation trade deal. Luxon and Todd McClay say it will create jobs, lift incomes, and open up India's huge market to New Zealand exporters. But once you look underneath the headline, the deal starts to look very uneven. When you lay the India FTA out side by side, it starts to look less like a brilliant trade deal and more like New Zealand giving away the shop for a headline. India gets 100% duty-free access into New Zealand from day one. That means Indian goods can come into our market tariff-free immediately. New Zealand, on the other hand, gets tariff reductions on some exports into India and then a few more reductions over time. New Zealand will never get the full free tariff India gets on all of their products. India also gets services sector gains, student and professional mobility benefits, and a 5,000-person temporary employment entry visa quota. New Zealand has to invest $20 billion US into India, and India invests $0 into New Zealand. And that is where the lopsided deal truly starts to take shape. That matters because investment does not just move money, it's knowledge, technology, systems, processes, branding, research, and commercial know-how. In practice, that could mean New Zealand expertise in dairy processing, agriculture, farming systems, food production, medicine, pharmaceuticals, education, tech and innovation being used to help build India's capacity, while India keeps protecting its own sensitive sectors, especially dairy and agriculture. The concern is that the deal encourages a one-way flow. New Zealand capital, expertise, and know-how into India, with no equal obligation for Indian investment, technology, or IP to flow back into New Zealand. So let's call this what it looks like. India negotiated like a country protecting its own interests. That is not hard-nosed negotiation. Luxon is calling it a once-in-a-generation deal, but perhaps he unable to understand. A bad deal can also be called a once-in-a-generation deal. And yes, it is fair to question whether this was just about votes, because this gives Luxon a shiny announcement to sell politically. But in my opinion, that shiny deal is just a polished turd.
I've done a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and I've done a lot of negotiations, getting the chemistry and getting the relationship right.